First, a little bit about Plutarch. Plutarch, 46 to 120, was the first modern biographer and the greatest biographer of the ancient world. He was born in central Greece about 100 years after the death of Julius Caesar. Plutarch's main interest was the characters of famous men and how these men shaped history. He was particularly interested in the story of the collapse of the Roman Republic between about 130 BC. After much reading and research, he wrote biographies of 10 important Romans who lived during the decline of Rome. Among them are Pompey, Caesar, Cicero, Brutus, and Antony, all of whom figure in one way or another in Shakespeare's play, The Tragedy of Julius Caesar. Shakespeare, in fact, read Plutarch in a translation that was published in England in 1579, and he based his play on Plutarch's biography. The selection that follows is a modern translation of the last part of Plutarch's life of Caesar. Julius Caesar, who lived from 102 to 44 BC, was born to a noble Roman family. His career was full of dramatic events, wars throughout the Mediterranean world, intrigue and undercover politics at home, civil war, dictatorship, government reforms. The last 5 years of Caesar's life were a particularly complex period in Roman history. Caesar's military victories in the Gallic Wars and the victories of Pompey, who was his son-in-law as well as his principal opponent in the government, brought Roman power to a new height. But Rome's republican form of government was weakening, and in 49 BC, Caesar's rivalry with Pompey flared into civil war. Caesar, then in the north of Italy, attacked the forces of Pompey and defeated them. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was eventually murdered, and Caesar was elected consul or ruling magistrate of the Republic. After defeating other opposing elements in the civil war, Caesar was named dictator for 10 years by the Roman Senate. He then sailed to Spain, defeated Pompey's sons, and returned to Rome. This selection from Plutarch opens with Caesar's victorious return to Rome. However, as Caesar enters the city in triumph, a conspiracy to overthrow him is already underway.
Hi there. Today I'm going to read, in case it helps you follow along, I'm going to be reading the excerpt from Plutarch's Life of Caesar. It's in your textbook, and I have included the pages for you also. I really do ask, please, that you follow along. This is not easy. It's old biography, so I think it'd be helpful for you to follow along as well. This is on page 231. What made Caesar most openly and mortally hated was his passion to become king. It was this which made the common people hate him for the first time, and it served as a most useful pretext for those others who had long hated him but had up to now disguised their feelings. Yet those who were trying to get this honor conferred on Caesar actually spread the story among the people that it was foretold in the Sibylline books that Parthia could only be conquered by the Romans if the Roman army was led by a king. And as Caesar was coming down from Alba to Rome, they ventured to salute him as king, which caused a disturbance among the people. Caesar, upset by this himself, said that his name was not king, but Caesar. These words were received in total silence, and he went on his way looking far from pleased. Then there was the occasion when a number of extravagant honors had been voted for him in the Senate, and Caesar happened to be sitting above the rostra. Here he was approached by the consuls and the praetors, with the whole Senate following behind. But instead of rising to receive them, he behaved to them as though they were merely private individuals, and after receiving their message, told them that his honors ought to be cut down rather than increased. This conduct of his offended not only the Senate, but the people as well, who felt that his treatment of the senators was an insult to the whole state. There was a general air of the deepest dejection, and everyone who was in a position to do so went away at once. Caesar himself realized what he had done and immediately turned to go home. He drew back his toga and, uncovering his throat, cried out in a loud voice to his friends that he was ready to receive the blow from anyone who liked to give it to him. Later, however, he excused this behavior on account of his illness, saying that those who suffer from it are apt to lose control of their senses if they address a large crowd while standing. And he's referring to referring to his epilepsy, using it as an excuse for behaving in a way that others perceived as rude. In these circumstances, they are all very subject to fits of giddiness and may fall into convulsions and insensibility. This excuse, however, was not true. Caesar himself was perfectly willing to rise to receive the Senate, but, so they say, one of his friends, or rather his flatterers, Cornelius Balbus, restrained him from doing so. Remember, he said, you are Caesar. You are their superior and ought to let them treat you as such. Another thing which caused offense was his insulting treatment of the tribunes. The Feast of the Lupercalia was being celebrated. Caesar, sitting on a golden throne above the rostra and wearing a triumphal robe, was watching this ceremony, and Antony, who was consul at the time, was one of those taking part in the sacred running. When he came running into the forum, the crowd made way for him. He was carrying a diadem, it's kind of like a crown, symbol of royalty, with a wreath of laurel tied around it, and he held this out to Caesar. His action was followed by some applause, but it was not much, and it was not spontaneous. But when Caesar pushed the crown away from him, there was a general shout of applause. Antony then offered the diadem for a second time, and again only a few applauded, though when Caesar rejected it, there was applause from everyone. Caesar, finding that the experiment had proved a failure, rose from his seat and ordered the wreath to be carried to the Capitol. It was then discovered that his statues had been decorated with royal diadems, and two of the tribunes, Flavius and Marcellus, went around the statues and tore down those decorations, taking the crowns off of the statues. They then found out who had been the first to salute Caesar as king and led them off to prison. The people followed the tribunes and were loud in their applause, calling them Brutuses, because it was Brutus who first put an end to the line of kings in Rome and gave the Senate and the people the power that had previously been in the hands of one man. This made Caesar angry. He deprived Marcellus and Flavius of their tribuneship, and in speaking against them, he insulted the people at the same time. It was in these circumstances that people began to turn their thoughts towards Marcus Brutus. He was thought to be on his father's side, a descendant of the Brutus who had abolished the monarchy. On his mother's side, he came from another famous family, the Servili, and he was the son-in-law and the nephew of Cato. But his own zeal for destroying the new monarchy was blunted by the honors and favors which he had received from Caesar. It was not only that at Pharsalus, after Pompey's flight, his own life had been spared and the lives of many of his friends at his request. He was also a person, Brutus was, in whom Caesar had particular trust. He had been given the most important of the praetorship for this very year and was to become consul 3 years later. For this post, he had been preferred to Cassius, who had been the rival candidate. Caesar, indeed, is said, Caesar indeed is said to have admitted that Cassius had the better claims of the two for the office. But, he added, I cannot pass over Brutus. And once, when the conspiracy was already formed and some people were actually accusing Brutus to Caesar of being involved in it, Caesar laid his hands on his body and said to the accusers, Brutus will wait for this skin of mine, implying that Brutus certainly had the qualities which would entitle him to the power, but that he would not, for the sake of power, behave basely or ungratefully. However, those who were eager for the change and who looked to Brutus as only, or at least as the most likely man to bring it about, used, without venturing, to approach him personally. They would come up to him at night and leave papers all over the platform and the chair where he sat to do his work. Most of the messages were of this kind: you're asleep, Brutus, or you are no real Brutus. And when Cassius observed that they were having at least something of an effect on Brutus's personal pride, he redoubled his own efforts to incite him further. Cassius, as I have mentioned in my life of Brutus, had reasons of his own for hating Caesar. Moreover, Caesar was suspicious of him and once said to his friends, what do you think Cassius is aiming at? Personally, I am not too fond of him. He is much too pale. And on another occasion, it is said, when Antony and Dolabella were accusing him of plotting a revolution, that Caesar said, I'm not much afraid of these fat, long-haired people. It's the other type I'm more frightened of, the pale, thin ones, by which he meant Brutus and Cassius. Fate, however, seemed not to be so much unexpected as unavoidable. Certainly, before this event, they say that strange signs were shown and strange apparitions were seen. As For the lights in the sky, the crashing sounds heard in all sorts of directions by night, the solitary specimens of birds coming down the forum, all these perhaps are scarcely worth mentioning in connection with so great an event as this. But the philosopher Strabo says that the great crowd of men, all on fire, were seen making a charge. Also, that from the hand of a soldier's slave, a great flame sprang out so that the hand seemed to the spectators to be burning away. But when the flame died out, the man was uninjured. He also says that when Caesar himself was making a sacrifice, the heart of the animal being sacrificed was missing. A very bad omen indeed, since in the ordinary course of nature, no animal could exist without a heart. There is plenty of authority, too, for the following story. So it's said that a soothsayer warned Caesar to be on his guard against a great danger on the day of the month of March that the Romans call the Ides of March. And when this day had come, Caesar, on his way to the Senate house, met with the soothsayer and greeted him jestingly with words, "Well, the Ides of March have come." "Yes, but they have not gone," the soothsayer replied in a soft voice. And on the previous day, Marcus Lepidus was entertaining Caesar at supper, and Caesar, according to his usual practice, happened to be signing letters as he reclined at table. Meanwhile, the conversation turned to the question of what sort of death was the best, and before anyone could express a view on the subject, Caesar cried out, "The kind that comes unexpectedly." After this, when he was sleeping as usual by the side of his wife, all the doors and windows of the bedroom flew open at once. Caesar, startled by the noise and by the light of the moon shining down on him, noticed that Calpurnia was fast asleep. But she was saying something in her sleep which he could not make out and was groaning in an inarticulate way. In fact, she was dreaming at that time that she was holding his murdered body in her arms and was weeping over it. Though some say that it was a different dream which she had. They say she had dreamed that she saw the gable ornament of the house torn down, and for this reason fancied that she was weeping and lamenting. In any case, when it was day, she implored Caesar, if it was possible, not to go out, and begged of him to postpone the meeting of the Senate, or if she said he had no confidence in her dreams, then he ought to inquire about the future by sacrifices and other methods of divination. Caesar himself, it seemed, was affected, and by no means easy in his mind, for he had never noticed any superstition in Calpurnia, and he now could see that she was in great distress. And when the prophets, after making many sacrifices, told him that the omens were not favorable, he decided to send for Antony and to go ahead and dismiss the Senate. At this point, Decimus Brutus, surnamed Albinus, intervened. Caesar had such confidence in him that he made him the second heir in his will, yet he was in the conspiracy with Brutus and Cassius. Now, fearing that if Caesar escaped this day, the whole plot would come to light, he spoke derisively of the prophets and told Caesar that he ought not to give the Senate such a good opportunity for thinking that they were being treated discourteously. They had met, he said, on Caesar's instructions, and they were ready to vote unanimously that Caesar should be declared king of all the provinces outside Italy, with the right of wearing a diadem in any other place except Italy, whether on sea or land. But if, when they were already in session, someone were to come and tell them that they must go away for the time being and come back when Calpurnia had better dreams, it would be easy to imagine what Caesar's enemies would have to say themselves and what sort of reception they would give to Caesar's friends, when they tried to prove that Caesar was not a slave master or a tyrant. If, however, he had really made up his mind to treat this day as inauspicious, then, Decimus Brutus said, it would be better for him to go himself to the Senate, speak personally to the senators, and adjourn the meeting. While he was speaking, Brutus took Caesar by the hand and began to lead him toward the door. And before he had gone far from the door, a slave belonging to someone else tried to approach him. But being unable to get near him because of the crowds who pressed around him, he forced his way into the house and put himself into the hands of Calpurnia, asking her to keep him safe until Caesar came back, since he had some very important information to give to him. Then there was Artemidorus. He was the teacher of Greek philosophy, who, for that reason, had become acquainted with Brutus and his friends. He had thus acquired a very full knowledge of the conspiracy, and he came to Caesar with a small document in which he had written down the information in which he intended to reveal to him. But he wanted to tell him that he was being conspired against, I should say. But when he saw that Caesar took each document that was given to him and then just handed it to one of his attendants, he came close up to him and said, "Read this one, Caesar, and read it quickly and by yourself I assure you that it is important and that it concerns you personally." Caesar then took the document and was several times on the point of reading it, but then was prevented from doing so by the numbers of people who came to speak to him. It was the only document which he did keep with him, and that he was still holding in his hand when he went on into the Senate. It may be said that all these things could have happened as it were by chance, but the place where the Senate was meeting that day, and which was to be the scene of the final struggle and of the assassination, made it perfectly clear that some heavenly power was at work, guiding the action and directing it that it should take place just here. For here stood a statue of old Pompey, and the building had been erected and dedicated by Pompey as one of the extra amenities attached to his theater. Indeed, it is said that just before the attack was made on him, Caesar turned his eyes toward the statue of Pompey and silently prayed for its goodwill. This was in spite of the fact that Caesar was a follower of the doctrines of Epicurus. Yet the moment of crisis, so it would seem, and the very imminence of the dreadful deed made him forget his former rationalistic view and filled him with an emotion that was intuitively or divinely inspired. Now Antony, who was a true friend of Caesar's, and also a strong man physically, was detained outside the Senate house by Brutus Albinus, who deliberately engaged him in a long conversation. Caesar himself went in, and the Senate rose in his honor. Some of Brutus's party took their place behind his chair, and others went to meet him as though they wished to support the petition being made by Tilius Cimber on behalf of his brother, who was in exile. So, all joining in with him in his entreaties, they accompanied Caesar to his chair. Caesar took his seat and continued to reject their request as they pressed him more and more urgently, and he began to grow angry with them. Tilius then took hold of his toga with both hands and pulled it down from his neck. This was the signal for the attack. The first blow was struck by Casca, who wounded Caesar in the neck with his dagger. The wound was not mortal and not even a deep one, coming as it did from a man who was no doubt much disturbed in mind at the beginning of such a daring venture. Caesar, therefore, was able to turn around and grasp the knife and hold on to it. At almost the same moment, the striker of the blow and he who was struck cried out together, "Caesar," in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" While Casca called to his brother in Greek, "Help, brother." So it began, and those who were not in the conspiracy were so horror-struck and amazed at what was being done that they were afraid to run away, and they were afraid to come to Caesar's help. But they were too afraid to even utter a word. But those who had come prepared for the murder all bared their daggers and hemmed Caesar in on every side. Whichever way he turned, he met the blows of daggers and saw the cold steel aimed at his face and at his eyes. So he was driven this way and that, and like a wild beast in the toils had to suffer from the hands of each of them, for it had been agreed that they each must take part in the sacrifice. And all flushed themselves with his blood. Because of this compact, Brutus also gave him one wound in the groin. Some say that Caesar fought back against all the rest, darting this way and that to avoid the blows and crying out for help. But when he saw that Brutus had drawn his dagger, he covered his head with his toga and sank down to the ground. Either by chance or because he was pushed there by his murderers, he fell down against the pedestal on which the statue of Pompey stood, and the pedestal was drenched with his blood, so that one might have thought that Pompey himself was presiding over this act of vengeance against his enemy, who lay there at his feet struggling convulsively under so many wounds. So Caesar was done to death, and when it was over, Brutus stepped forward with the intention of making a speech to explain what had been done. The senators, however, would not wait to hear him. They rushed out through the doors of the building and fled to their homes, thus producing a state of confusion, terror, and bewilderment amongst the people. Some bolted their doors, others left their counters and shops and could be observed either running to see the place where Caesar had been killed or, once they had seen it, running back again. Antony and Lepidus, who were Caesar's chief friends, stole away and hid in houses belonging to other people. Brutus and his party, on the other hand, just as they were, still hot and eager from the murder, marched all together in one body from the Senate house to the Capitol, holding up their naked daggers in front of them, and far from giving the impression that they wanted to escape, looked glad and confident. They called out to the people that liberty had been restored, and they invited the more distinguished persons whom they met to join in with them. Some of these did join in the procession and go up with them to the Capitol, pretending they had taken part in the deed and thus claiming their share in the glory of it. Among these were Caius Octavius and Lentulus Spinther, who suffered later for their imposture. They were put to death by Antony and young Caesar, and didn't even have the satisfaction of enjoying the fame which caused their death, since no one believed that they had taken part in the action. Even those who inflicted the death penalty on them were punishing them not for what they did, but for what they would have liked to have done. Next day, Brutus and his party came down from the Capitol, and Brutus made a speech. The people listened to what he said without expressing either pleasure or resentment at what had been done. Their complete silence indicated that they both pitied Caesar and that they respected Brutus. The Senate passed a decree of amnesty and tried to reconcile all parties. It was voted that Caesar should be worshipped as a god and that there should be no alteration made, however small, in any of the measures passed by him while he was in power. On the other hand, provinces and appropriate honors were given to Brutus and his friends. Everyone thought, therefore, that things were not only settled, but settled in the best possible way. But when Caesar's will was opened, and it was discovered that he had left a considerable legacy to each Roman citizen, and when people saw his body all disfigured with its wounds being carried through the forum, they broke through all bounds of discipline and order. They made a great pile of benches, railings, and tables from the forum, and placing the body upon this, burned it there. Then, carrying blazing brands, they set fire to the houses of the murderers, while others went up and down through the city, trying to find the men themselves to tear them to pieces. They, however, were well barricaded, and not one of them came in the way of the mob. But there was a man called Cinna. He was one of Caesar's friends, who they say happened to have had a strange dream during the previous night. He dreamed that Caesar invited him to supper, and then that he declined the invitation. Caesar then led him along by the hand, though he did not want to go and was pulling in the opposite direction. Now when Cinna heard that they were burning Caesar's body in the forum, he got up and went there out of respect for his memory, though he felt a certain amount of misgiving as a result of his dream and was also suffering from a fever. One of the crowd saw him there and asked who he was and when he had learned his name, told it to another. So the name was passed on, and it was quickly accepted by everyone that here was one of the men who had murdered Caesar, since among the conspirators there was in fact a man with this same name as Cinna. The crowd, thinking that this was he, rushed on him and tore him limb from limb on the spot. It was this more than anything else which frightened Cassius and Brutus, and within a few days they withdrew from the city. What they did and what happened to them before they died has been related in my Life of Brutus. Caesar was 56 years old when he died. He had survived Pompey by not much more than 4 years. As for the supreme power which he had pursued during the whole course of his life, throughout such dangers, and which at last and with such difficulty he had achieved, the only fruit he reaped from it was an empty name and a glory which made him envied by his fellow citizens. But that great divine power or genius which had watched over him and helped him in his lifetime, even after his death, remained active as an avenger of his murder, pursuing and tracking down the murderers over every land and sea until not one of them was left, and visiting with retribution all, without exception, who were in any way concerned either with the death itself or with the planning of it. So far as human coincidences are concerned, the most remarkable was that which concerned Cassius. After his defeat at Philippi, he killed himself with the very same dagger which he had used against Caesar. And of supernatural events, there was first the great comet, which shone very brightly for 7 nights after Caesar's murder and then disappeared, and also the dimming of the sun. For the whole of that year, the sun's orbs rose dull and pale, and the heat which came down from it was feeble and ineffective, so that the atmosphere, with insufficient warmth to penetrate it, lay dark and heavy on the earth, and fruits and vegetables never properly ripened, withering away and falling off before they were mature because of the coldness of the air. But more than anything else, the phantom which appeared to Brutus made it clear that the murder of Caesar was not pleasing to the gods. The story is as follows. Brutus was about to take his army across from Abydos to the mainland on the other side of the straits, and one night he was lying down as usual in his tent, not asleep but thinking about the future. He fancied that he heard a noise at the entrance of the tent, and looking towards the light of the lamp, which was almost out, he saw a terrible figure, like a man, though unnaturally large, and with a very severe expression. He was frightened at first, but finding that this apparition just stood silently by his bed without doing or saying anything, he replied, "Who are you?" And the phantom replied, "Brutus, I am your evil genius. You shall see me at Philippi." On this occasion, Brutus answered courageously, "Then I shall see you." And the supernatural visitor at once went away. Time passed, and he drew up his army against Antony and Caesar near Philippi. In the first battle, he conquered the enemy divisions that were opposed to him, and after routing them, broke through and sacked Caesar's camp. They're talking about Octavius Caesar, who's the cousin of, he's the nephew of Julius Caesar, sorry. But in the night before the second battle, the same phantom visited him again. It spoke no word, but Brutus realized that his fate was upon him and exposed himself to every danger in the battle, trying to die. He did not die, however, in the fighting. It was after his troops had been routed out that he retired to a steepy rock place, put his naked sword to his breast, and with the help of a friend, so they say, who assisted him in driving the blow home, killed himself. So this is the excerpt that your book gives you from Plutarch's Life of Caesar. You can see it's a really interesting biographical depiction of one of the most famous moments in political history. And then Shakespeare decides he's going to write a play about it, and he's going to bring this drama to the stage. What might be an interesting extra credit assignment for some of you guys might be to take this account from Plutarch and sort of compare it to some places where Shakespeare's presenting similar scenes or behaviors.